Golden Gate well and then work into the Collier-Hogan well. You might not know it, but in Southwest Florida, plans are underway to greatly expand oil drilling. 3 years ago, Dan A. Hughes, a Texas oil company, applied for permits to drill only 1,000 feet from homes in Naples. It was part of a huge project to drill 115,000 acres. The target was a Sunnyland Trend, an underground oil formation that stretches from Fort Myers to Miami. Although industry has been drilling here since 1943, when oil in Florida was first discovered near Immokalee, it's been mostly under the radar since only 2% of the wells ever produce. Now industry is coming back, this time with new technology like horizontal drilling, matrix acidizing, and hydraulic fracturing. These well stimulation treatments involve the underground injection of toxic chemicals that pose a threat to public health and Florida's water. Residents first learned about the drill site when they received a letter asking them for contact information so they could be evacuated in case of an explosion, gas leak, or other drilling disaster. Jennifer Jones, referenced in the letter, said that if something goes wrong, if a well blows up, hazardous gases can be released. Alarmed, hundreds packed an informational meeting expressing fear and outrage that over 30 families were being placed in an emergency evacuation zone, only feet from a large-scale industrial drill site and a 145-foot oil rig at deadly risk to hydrogen sulfide gas leaks, just because the oil industry moved into their neighborhood. Right away, we learned two things. First, we were up against Florida's strong laws against the oil and gas industry, and second, there was no time to waste, since permits were being pushed through in as little as 30 days. We met with everyone, from Collier Resources to legislators to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, as well as organized a non-stop series of public actions. From town hall meetings, to street corner protests, to candlelight vigils, to a march by land and sea on the Governor Rick Scott's home. Twice in 2 years, to a house party for Senator Dwight Bullard, who urged DEP to deny the permit. We spoke at meetings, many meetings, some painful ones, as well as promoted letter writing campaigns that buried the DEP and EPA in over 165,000 public comments. As a result, both agencies traveled to Naples. The hearings were filled, with fire marshals closing the doors and overflow spilling into the street, and both agencies extending deadlines. When the permit was issued, 3 lawsuits challenged it. This brings us to the breaking news about Hughes being fined $25,000 for fracking a different well, the Collier-Hogan well, next to Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, a 5,000-year-old forest with some of the last old-growth cypress in the world. Let's take a closer look at what happened at the Hogan well, since it is one of the first cases of fracking in Florida, and we have access to trade secret documents, from chemical lists to workover notices. These were disclosed only as a result of great public concern and political pressure put on Governor Scott in his hometown during election year. Such trade secrets will not likely be disclosed ever again. And so we'd like to share with you what we learned. The Collier-Hogan well is located in the Big Cypress Swamp watershed on the Hogan Island farm. Its access road is gated, so the only way we could see it was from a Mockley Road with binoculars or overhead by airplane. Directly to the east is Corkscrew Swamp, to the west is Immokalee, the nation's top tomato-producing region. And to the south, directly down gradient, lie the county's well fields, where we pull our groundwater. Also to the south is the Camp Keys flowway that carries water through the Fakahatchee to the Gulf of Mexico and into the 10,000 islands. Given the hydrologic importance of this area, it should not be drilled or fracked. Nevertheless, Hughes received a drilling permit in December 2012 and an operating permit in August 2013. The company drilled vertically over 2 miles and then horizontally nearly 1 mile, hoping to strike oil in the lower Sunnyland. To increase well productivity, Hughes submitted 3 workovers, and you can see them mapped out here. It's important to realize that the state classifies hydraulic fracturing and acidizing as workover procedures. This simply means that industry does not need to submit a new permit application prior to fracking, only a notification. First, in September, Hughes matrix acidized the Hogan well, which means they injected acid and other fluids into the well under the fracture gradient to dissolve rock. This treatment raised no red flags, even though hazardous fracking chemicals were used along with hydrochloric acid. According to the letter from Hughes, the results were fairly poor but encouraging. They wanted to go bigger. Second, in October, Hughes submitted a hydraulic fracturing proposal by Halliburton, but then withdrew it in December. The workover notice is clearly labeled as hydraulic fracturing and shows that fracking was on the table despite Hughes's denials. And now for the third and final workover, the one that would eventually trigger fines, penalties, lawsuits, revocation, and closing of the Hogan well. But first, let's clear up the confusion about what to call this workover. Hughes denied having fracked and said they used an acid stimulation treatment very similar to the ones commonly used in Florida for 50 years. Expert consultants disagreed and concluded that the Hogan well had been hydraulically fractured. Considering the volume of fluids used in all 7 stages, the workover would be considered multi-stage high-volume hydraulic fracturing. And they say that over and over again in their report. So, on December 23, Hughes submitted the workover. It raised red flags. DEP told Hughes not to do a procedure that had never been used before in Florida until additional review could be done. Hughes postponed 1 day and then went ahead with fracking without department approval. The next day, DEP issued a cease and desist order signed by then DEP Secretary Herschel Vineyard, saying that the department did not have sufficient information that the proposed workover would be protective of the state's groundwater resources. Hughes continued in direct defiance. They completed the hydraulic fracturing job the next day, willing to pay the small fine and enter into a consent order where Hughes was responsible for investigating the impacts of its own wrongdoing. This underscores, to put it politely, the lack of regulatory oversight. The fracking operation lasted 2.5 days, beginning December 30th and ending January 1st, the very worst way to ring in the new year. Worse yet, DEP was on site at the time of the fracking to observe but not stop the violation, because as DEP Secretary Herschel Vineyard told us, the inspector did not have enforcement powers. Now, we find it beyond belief that DEP photographed the cancer-causing chemicals, but failed to stop the violation, failed to notify the county, failed to test the groundwater, failed to test the flowback, and kept secret the violation for months during all the key federal and state hearings. Worst of all, despite the violation and having put our water at risk, DEP continued to permit Hughes to produce oil at the Hogan well from January through April without testing our water or the well's integrity. Inconceivable. Every day delayed was an added day of potential exposure to contaminated water. Outraged, we filled the county commission meetings repeatedly for months. The good news is that for the first time ever, the county, with the Conservancy as interveners, sued the state on oil drilling, calling for revocation, remediation, water testing, and much more. The lawsuit compelled DEP to start water testing. The problem was that no one gets their drinking water from 3 to 13 feet. And these shallow wells would not detect contamination until long after public water supplies were completely compromised. The Conservancy, thankfully, entered into an agreement with DEP to secure a deep monitoring well to test for upward migration of chemicals toward our public water supply. A critical safeguard they had to fight tooth and nail for. Echoing our concerns, United States Senator Bill Nelson ordered a federal investigation of Hughes. He wrote, "We cannot tolerate expanded industrial drilling activities that pose a threat to the drinking and surface water so close to the Florida Everglades, one of the world's great environmental treasures." Which brings us to the #1 concern with the Hogan frack job, water contamination. There are multiple pathways for contamination. One, and this is a pretty tricky slide here, surface spills can seep down into groundwater. The report shows spills at the Hogan well, including leaks from pipes, releases from a dumpster, and an oily sheen observed on the canal. Oil-stained lime rock was excavated and transported to an incinerator, whatever that means, in Miami. 2, poor well construction can result in leaks from the well casings into water supplies. And it looks kind of like that, you know, they can come out that way, the fracking fluids. The report discloses faulty well construction, including failing to set the surface pipe to the proper depth, poorly cementing casings, dropping tools down the borehole that weren't fished out, and failing to pressure test the casings to see if they could handle the pressures of the frack job. The report concluded that, I quote, "possible junk left in the hole along with poor cement jobs could have provided pathways for contamination." More than troubling. 3, migration through underground pathways is a concern because the Hogan well is located near 2 improperly plugged and abandoned wells from the 1940s. These provide a potential pathway for fracking fluids to migrate and surface over time into our drinking water. 4, improper disposal of flowback. Flowback is so toxic that it must be permanently removed from the water cycle through deep well injection. The Hogan site did not have an injection well. Trucking logs show that over 203,000 gallons of flowback was transported across the Everglades to Rader Environmental in Opelika for pretreatment. But Rader was unaware that they were treating fracking wastewater and so mixed it with city wastewater and disposed of it through a combination of ocean outfall and municipal injection well. The overwhelming evidence of failures, oversights, accidents, and violations is more than alarming, especially since the Hogan well is located in the Big Cypress Swamp watershed. a critical recharge area that replenishes levels in the Everglades and fills the aquifers we rely on for drinking water. Fortunately, Hughes was facing increasing opposition, state fines and penalties, a federal EPA investigation, a Section 7 under the Endangered Species Act, multiple lawsuits, relentless community protests, and most importantly, news reports in Associated Press, Truth Out, Al Jazeera, Russian Times, NPR, Fox 4, Naples Daily News, and even a Louisiana reporter who flew us over the frac site so we could photograph the damage. Finally, in what can only be called a historic shutdown, Hughes announced it was abandoning all plans to explore for oil in Florida. The Texas Oil Company terminated its 115,000-acre oil lease, while the state revoked all the company's permits and filed a lawsuit for cleanup, as well as promised us stronger oil and gas laws. Most significantly, Hughes' proposed drill site that placed 30 families in an emergency evacuation zone was turned into a watermelon field. Sweet, and that picture went by really quick, but there was a picture of a watermelon field. The current status. Subsequently, Hughes filed a countersuit against DEP, and then in January, the two reached a settlement agreement. All I can say with certainty is that the well has been plugged and abandoned, and groundwater monitoring is ongoing. Did DEP recover costs and collect fines? We have not heard back. The latest violation can't be ignored. It shows that fracking in the Hogan well in 2013 continues to threaten our water supplies. DEP just discovered that Hughes illegally dumped 100 barrels of waste from its fracking operation down the Hogan well before abandoning it. They injected a mixture of acidic chemicals, oil, and water between the casings. DEP once again failed to secure, I quote, a sufficient volume to adequately test. How is that even possible with 100 barrels? Here's the report and a long list of requests from the Conservancy to DEP, and they are waiting for a report back. Some of the lessons we learned: multiple types of well stimulation are being used, and all inject similar toxic chemicals that can contaminate water and threaten public health. Both the acid stimulation and fracking at the Hogan well involve the injection of chemicals that can cause eye and skin irritation, blindness, and birth defects. We also learned that fracking and other chemical treatments are legal in Florida, without the state having the clear authority to restrict or even stop their use. Once an operating permit is issued, industry is free to frack at any time. They don't need to submit a new permit application, only notification. We also learned that local government and the public are not notified of well stimulations, and they do not have the power to obtain information due to drillers withholding it under trade secret law. They're withholding chemical lists and safety sheets, making it very difficult for health professionals and first responders to handle spills and exposure, and nearby citizens to assess risks. They're also denying the state access to the drill site. This photo from the Hogan well tells the story of how John Arthur and DEP staff were denied access to the drill site and instead had to investigate the violation through binoculars from the edge of the well pad. Imagine, it's like denying police access to a crime scene. It clearly shows how trade secret protections are putting the public at risk. We also learned that the #1 problem with fracking is that it depletes and contaminates water. It uses thousands of gallons of fresh water mixed with toxic chemicals, everything from benzene, a known carcinogen, to hydrochloric acid, a corrosive that eats bone, steel, and rock. The Hogan frac job used over 662,000 gallons in 2.5 days. The water used is contaminated forever, and unlike agricultural water, can never be reused. It is permanently polluted and must be permanently removed from the water cycle through deep well injection, making this an irresponsible and one-time use of water. If the Hogan well were still operational, it would be permitted to destroy 280 million gallons of fresh water every year. Additionally, we learned waste is not properly tracked of or disposed of. Abandoned wells are not addressed. Fines are not large enough to deter. Bonds are not large enough to cover the cost of remediation, so the cost falls on taxpayers. So too, legislation that was introduced last year would have caused more harm than good. It would have excluded the most common form of fracking, matrix acidizing, while taking away local government's authority to ban fracking, restrict traffic, and everything else the state does not consider when issuing drilling permits. And finally, we learned that DEP lacks the power to protect us. They're overworked, underfunded, and crippled by laws written by and for the oil industry. Worse yet, they don't even have state standards that will protect citizens against the local dangers of fracking. The traffic, noise, lights, pollution, only local government can address these local impacts. Therefore, we must maintain home rule. Our point is that these unproven treatments like matrix acidizing and hydraulic fracturing that involve the underground injection of toxic chemicals are not safe, not here. Contamination of Florida's water is possible in every step of the process, from storage containers to tanker trucks to injection wells. Accidents happen, pipes leak, injected fluid surface, and cement casings fail. Because it only takes one incident to taint or even ruin a community's aquifer, fracking is not in the public interest. You can't clean up an aquifer. To end on a happy note, the good news is that local communities are stepping up to protect our water. They're adopting local fracking bans. We need hundreds of bans up and down the state, holding the line from Ochapi to Micanopy. We have sample, or rather the Conservancy has sample ordinances you can use. Miami did their part in protecting the Everglades, and now it's Collier County's turn. We will need your help to secure a local ban and to stop oil operations on 350,000 acres in and near the Big Cypress National Preserve. We will need your voices, your letters, and your presence to protect the Everglades and our water, and to stop Alligator Alley from becoming Cancer Alley. Contact us here. If you have a phone with you now, you can send us a text message with your name and email. And to conclude, a threat to water anywhere is a threat to water everywhere. So thank you for being here and for caring. You make us strong. Together, let's protect the land, water, and air that sustains us all.